I just want to kind of do a little introduction because I did a preview of Chris's presentation a couple of nights ago down in Thurmont, and I thought it was kind of important that he kind of has a starting basis to know who his audience is and what they're aware of and what they're not aware of, and how you tiptoe into describing some of the things in the world that go on that might not be as they appear. And I'm just going to do a show of hands here. Vote if you want, don't if you don't. There's no wrong answers, but I just want to see if anybody's here who's old enough. Do you remember what you were doing when the JFK assassination happened? You remember. And raise your hand if you believe the Warren Commission's official story of the lone gunman. As far as 9/11, do you remember where you were when you first heard about 9/11? So these are pivotal points. These are pivotal moments in your life, is what I'm getting at. That very rarely does somebody not remember some of those stories if they were in that generation at all. And this is kind of our. The 9/11 is our JFK of this generation, as far as I'm concerned. Raise your hand if you feel that the 9/11 Commission performed an adequate investigation and presented all evidence and detailed the events of what happened on 9/11. Okay, you've got a good audience. Does anybody here know who owned and operated the World Trade Center complex? Do you know what the definition of a false flag event is? Do you know how many buildings collapsed or were fully destroyed on 9/11? Was it 2 or more than 2? Raise your hand if you believe, without a doubt, that a 757 flew into the Pentagon on 9/11. Raise your hand if you believe at least 50% of the official report of 9/11. So I don't have to raise my hand for less than 50. All right, without further ado then, I want to introduce Chris Bollyn. I'm in the process of reading one of his books, which you'll have available here tonight. I highly suggest that you get one of these books and read it. It's a compilation, chronological. The one book is a chronological order of all his articles that he's written since 2001 in chronological order, and just little short tidbits, so it's good, easy reading. And so what he's doing here tonight with this presentation is the Reader's Digest version, so you'll never, he would be here for hours and hours if he wanted to go into any kind of detail. So he skims across the surface, but it sounds like from the looks of the crowd, you'll have a receptive audience as far as people will understand what he's talking about. You're not being blindsided by this. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Chris Bollyn.
Can you hear me? Is it working? Okay. Yes, sir. Thank you, Brian, and big thanks to Henry for hosting me here, and these two guys for sponsoring this event, and the Firehouse. Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here. My name is Christopher Bollyn, and I'm the author of Solving 9/11, The Deception That Changed the World. That is the smaller book that I have. The larger book that he was talking about, unfortunately, I don't have any copies with me. We had a big event in Washington, D.C. last night, and they took them all. But if you would like a copy of that book, which I don't have, you can buy it from me tonight. Just give me your name and address and a contact phone number, and I will have one sent to you within a few days. So these are photos of me having my one-man manifestation outside the Academy Awards last February 22nd in Hollywood. This is the book, Solving 9/11, The Deception That Changed the World. This is the smaller book, which I do have about 14 copies with. This is my analysis presented in a concise format, easy to read. And the other book, the original articles, is the companion to this. That has all the articles that I wrote from 2001 September through to April 2012. And that's like the mother lode. That contains all the research and all the facts that support the thesis that I present in this book. My background is that I was an investigative journalist in Washington, D.C. for a little paper there when 9/11 happened. I was passing through New York City on the morning with my family, early in the morning actually, and I had been working as an investigative journalist between 2000 and 2006, so that was very good for me because that meant that I was being paid to do the research for the first 5 years, which was very helpful. And it fell right into my domain of the kind of things that I investigated, because I have a history of investigating such catastrophes where democratic governments pushed the story under the rug. In Estonia, in Sweden, there was a shipwreck called the Estonia in 1994. It was the worst shipwreck in European history since World War II, in which 1,000 people died. But the government of Sweden was clearly pushing the truth of what happened to that ship under the carpet. And I spent a lot of time working on that case. And also cases like TWA Flight 800, when clearly eyewitnesses saw something very different from what the government told us happened. So these are government cover-ups. When 9/11 happened, this was the big whopper of cover-ups. So I had worked as a journalist, and prior to that, I had a degree in history. I earned my degree in history from the University of California in Santa Cruz. My specialty is Middle Eastern history, especially Israel and Palestine. That was my area of focus. Then I wrote the Solving 9/11 books. These books are a product of a long time. The original articles, as I said, are the articles in chronological order from 2001 through 2012. And this other book, the smaller book, I began writing when I went into exile in Europe in 2007. And I started writing that in 2007, and I only finished it in 2011, early 2012. And prior to that, I was an Eagle Scout, and I grew up in Illinois, outside Chicago. This photograph is me working on I was presenting evidence at the Citizens Grand Jury in Los Angeles in 2004, I think it was. So here we are 14 years later. Why does 9/11 truth matter? Why is it important to understand what happened on 9/11? Some people will say, well, that's a long time ago. What difference does it make? It's over now. We fought the wars. They're over. Well, they're not over. Well, a good analogy is, why does the murder of President John F. Kennedy still matter, almost 53 years later? The murder of Kennedy matters because it was a coup d'etat. The powers behind the assassination took control of the government and orchestrated the cover-up. And a coup d'etat that is kept secret in a democratic republic like ours means that the succeeding government is illegitimate. As you know, the United States was involved in Vietnam for 20 years, from 55 to 75. But after Kennedy was killed, that's when the big ramping up occurred. Kennedy was actually ready to pull the troops out of Vietnam. The Kennedy assassination still matters because the United States government continues to support the lies of the Warren Commission. The Warren Commission, of course, claims that Harvey Oswald was not part of the conspiracy and he was the lone assassin. And the Kennedy assassination still matters because the mainstream media continues to this day to support and even endorse the Warren Commission. The Kennedy assassination matters because when the government supports the lies about the murder of the president, it means that the powers that killed Kennedy are still in charge. This is just a graph showing how Americans historically have felt about the Kennedy assassination. The top line indicates that most people, the overwhelming majority, believe that there was a conspiracy. So, next analogy is why does 9/11 still matter 14 years later? 9/11 matters because the government continues to lie about what happened to this very day. 9/11 matters because it was a policy coup that brought us the war on terror and a series of disastrous wars. The war on terror began in October 2001, less than a month after the attacks of 9/11, and is ongoing to the present day. We still have almost 10,000 troops in Afghanistan, and that number will likely increase in the near future. Why are we in Afghanistan, though? What is America's strategic or national interest in Afghanistan? Now, the latest phase in the war on terror, you probably all know, is this dodgy group called Islamic State that wears ski masks in the desert. I would venture to say that they wear ski masks because they want to hide their identity. The overwhelming majority of the people who are in this group are actually mercenaries who are hired from other countries. Well, in 2014, the Israeli intelligence site called Site Intelligence Group, sent a video of the beheading of the second American to its subscribers before the group itself had released the video. This is the woman. She's from Bethesda, Maryland. She's an Iraqi from Israel. Her name is Rita Katz, and she's in charge of this website, Site Intelligence Group. And as you see, almost all of the videos that come to us about this Islamic State come with her logo at the top of the video. And there's another group called Memory. Both of these are Israeli intelligence websites. Sites, they're not just websites, but they operate by distributing the videos and information about these terrorist groups to the media. They feed the media. So everything basically that we know about this so-called Islamic State comes to us from Israeli intelligence. From Bethesda. She's from Bethesda, right. Now here's the latest terrorist video that came out this week. And this claims to show the 9 terrorists who carried out the attacks in Paris, the recent attacks in Paris. And they're beheading and shooting captives. These are images that were taken before they went to Paris. But this is sort of like the icing on the cake, so we all walk away saying, oh yes, these guys are the ones who did it, they're from ISIS. That's why Europe and America have to go wage war against ISIS now. And 9/11 Truth matters because for 14 years, the mass media has pushed the lies about 9/11 and the fraudulent war on terror, all the while suppressing the very real evidence and facts that disprove the official myth. Why the war on terror will never end. Thank you very much. Now, as you probably know, most of the media outlets in this country are now in the hands of 6 companies. 6 corporations, 6 companies own virtually all the media in the country. One of the big moguls is the man on the left here. His name is Rupert Murdoch. He owns News Corp, and Fox, and companies like that, film companies, everything. But he has people who have promoted the 9/11 myth, like Mr. Murdoch. When the war was going to be starting in 2003 against Iraq, he owned 160 newspapers, and every one of his editors for those 160 newspapers agreed with Mr. Murdoch on the need to invade Iraq. So there's not a lot of decision or a lot of differing points of view within his papers. People like him, banksters, are supported by banksters like the Rothschilds, who create such media moguls in order to control public opinion. In the final analysis, the people, are being subjected to an ongoing psychological warfare operation 24/7, and it comes to us through the media. So if the government and media are lying to us about 9/11, it means that they, the government and media, are controlled by the very same people who carried out 9/11. That's a very important, that gives you an idea of how serious our political situation here is in this country today. This is just a little chart to show you that if you don't believe the official account, as I gather most of you don't, you're in the majority, because only 40% in the most generous poll, only 40% of American people believe the official narrative, the official report of what happened on 9/11. This shows that as they were doing polling in the 2002, 2004, 2006, they found in 2006 finally that only 16% of the people believed the official report. And after that they stopped polling because they were losing numbers all the time. Well, if you're skeptical of the 9/11 Commission, you're in very good hands, because the people who created that 9/11 Commission report don't believe it themselves. This is a senior counsel. His name is John Farmer. He's a senior counsel to the 9/11 Commission. And he wrote in a book that he wrote after this, he said, what the government and military officials told Congress, the Commission, the media, and the public about who knew what when was almost entirely and inexplicably untrue. And here are the 2 commissioners, Thomas Keane and Lee Hamilton. And Thomas Keane said, To this day, we don't know why NORAD told us what they told us. It was just so far from the truth. So there's nobody who really believes in this myth that they've created, apart from a few people who are woefully deceived by watching too much television. This is the cover of New York Times, the second day, the day after. And Larry Johnson from the U.S. State Department, he's a deputy director, former deputy director of counterterrorism. He looked at the sophistication of the 9/11 tragedy, the 9/11 crime, and he said that we don't have anything in history to compare with this. The only thing that comes close to it is a former Soviet intelligence operation. After 9/11 happened, I was working at my house in Chicago. We had been passing through New York City early in the morning on 9/11, but then when everything happened, I couldn't go to Washington, so we went back to Chicago. And I started writing, and I started writing about how the government and the media were deceiving us about things like explosions and evidence of Israeli involvement. And I thought it would probably be safer for me to be in Europe, because I could see that our country was quickly going insane over this whole thing, and that we were ready to go to war. And if the government was going to go to war and the media were in lockstep with the government, I said it's probably not very safe for me to be writing these articles on a weekly basis, disproving what the government said. So I went to Berlin, and I became a foreign correspondent for my newspaper. And one of the first people I spoke to was this man, Mr. Wertebach, who was the former president of the German Verfassungsschutz, the intelligence agency. And he told me that the deathly precision and magnitude of planning would have required years of planning and the fixed frame of a state intelligence organization in order to carry out these crimes. This could not have been done by some college students, in Hamburg. Likewise, this could not have been done by Osama bin Laden in a cave in Afghanistan suffering from kidney disease. It's just far beyond their capabilities. Another man I met was this man, Andreas von Bülow. He was the former parliamentarian in charge of German intelligence. And this is Mr. von Bülow and I walking down the Rhine River at Remagen. This was taken 10 years after we first met. I went back and visited him again. And what he told me when I first met him in November 2001 is he told me that such operations like this, such a sophisticated operation, false flag operation. A false flag operation means that the crime is committed with the full intention of blaming somebody else. And it's a old Navy term. False flag meaning somebody else's flag is flying on your staff while you're committing a crime. He told me that there are 3 levels of management of such a crime. There's the architectural level, the managerial level, and the working level. The architectural level, they are committing this crime and fixing it on somebody else, the blame on somebody else, in order to affect public opinion. For example, in this case, they wanted to affect American public opinion to get us to be willing to go to war in the Middle East on a long-term basis, which is where we are now. They succeeded in doing that. The managerial level, they are the ones who manage the working level. They manage the people who are going to take the blame. In this case, for example, the 19 Arabs, they're the working level, and they're part of the deception. The managerial level are the people who kind of control those 19 people or control our perception of what those 19 people did and who they are. And he went on to say that 95% of the work of intelligence agencies around the world is deception and disinformation. Isn't that nice? He also said that journalists who even raise the simplest questions, journalists don't even raise the simplest questions, those who differ are labeled as crazy. Now, here's the 19 Arabs, the 19 hijackers, 15 of whom lived in Florida. Most of them lived in Hollywood, Florida. And what's interesting about this is that many of these men, I think almost all of them, had duplicate licenses issued in their names, or they had claimed that they had lost their passport. And when you read the details about this, these guys would go for a license in the DMV in Florida. They'd get the license, they'd go home, and the next day somebody else would call up and say, I'm Muhammad Atta, and I have moved to a new address. I need a new license with my new address on it. And they sent them in the mail. So then what you had is you had 2 people with the same name on the ID in 2 different places. So what you have is identity theft. Somebody is leaving a false trail in somebody else's name, which is an old Israeli Mossad trick. If you've read any John le Carré, he wrote a book called The Little Drummer Girl. He wrote it in 1982. He wrote it with the help of the Israeli Mossad and senior chiefs of Israeli military intelligence, which he says in the very beginning of the book. And they made a movie out of it with Diane Keaton. And one of the big Mossad guys says in the book, he says, terror is theater. Theater's a con trick. Do you know what that means, con trick? You've been deceived. And you should keep that in mind, because almost all the terrorism that we see happening in this country today, from San Bernardino to the place out in Connecticut, all of it is mostly theater. It's not genuine. It's theater. And it's meant to affect how you think about certain things. Guns, Middle Easterners, Muslims, Arabs, what have you. It's theater. This is what the New York Times wrote 3 years after 9/11 in an article, in an editorial entitled The Public Knowledge of 9/11. The first sentence says it all. They said, in the 3 years since 9/11, we've begun to understand that it's possible to know what happened without knowing what happened. That's the logic of the New York Times. Now, the New York Times is, to understand, it's a family-owned paper. It's owned by the Sulzberger Ox family. And the Sulzberger Ox family are one of the founding families of the B'nai B'rith Lodge number 1 in New York. So, the B'nai B'rith is a Masonic organization to which only Jewish men can belong if they're Zionist. Non-Zionists are not welcome. So, if 9/11 is a deception, as I will try to show you in this presentation tonight, what is the war on terror? Can it be any more authentic than the fraud that begat it? Where did this war on terror come from? Well, the war on terror is a Zionist Israeli fraud based on lies and deception and exaggeration, as it was when it was first pushed by Benjamin Netanyahu in the late 1970s. The war on terror is essentially a Zionist war agenda to be fought by the United States and others. Here's Mr. Netanyahu in the late 70s. He was working for Boston Consulting Group, a Rothschild-owned firm. And in 1979, he went back, and he and his father created this organization called the Netanyahu Institute on Terrorism. And it was named after his brother, who was killed in Entebbe. And this is Mr. Netanyahu on 9/11. He was interviewed by the New York Times, and he was asked, how will this affect U.S.-Israeli relations? And he said, it's very good. He said, it will generate immediate sympathy. Now you have to ask yourself, what kind of person would say, in a catastrophe in which 3,000 people were killed, that it's very good? It's very good. It just doesn't make sense. It's a contradiction. How can you think such a thing? A couple years later, speaking in Hebrew in Israel at Bar Ilan University, he said, we are benefiting from one thing, meaning the Israeli audience he was speaking to. We are benefiting from one thing, and that is the attack on the Twin Towers and Pentagon and the American struggle in Iraq. Those are 3 things. But in his mind, they're one thing. I should point out, it's important to understand that Mr. Netanyahu is the chairman of the Likud coalition and has been the chairman since 1993. I'll come back to the Likud in a minute. Also on September 11th, here we have Israel's most decorated soldier and former Prime Minister, Ehud Barak. And he was in the London studio of the BBC World, which is the largest English-speaking television network in the world. It's broadcast from Pakistan to South Africa, all around the world. And he said, before the towers had even fallen, he was giving his opinion of who was behind this. And he said that the world will never be the same from today on. We know who's behind this, he said. It's bin Laden, basically, he said. And he said, it's now time for the United States to launch an operational, concrete war against terror. So the war against terror is an Israeli construct. 9/11 happens, and suddenly the Israelis are telling us, there you go, now it's time, let's go to war. Well, what is the relationship between Mr. Barak and Mr. Netanyahu? Mr. Netanyahu is the one who's been pushing this for years in his books and articles and speeches. He's been pushing it since 1979. That's been his career. That's Netanyahu. Mr. Barak was his commanding officer in the Sayeret Matkal. The Sayeret Matkal is an independent covert force that serves directly under the Israeli Chief of Staff and military intelligence. Independent meaning that it's not part of the usual army. It does its own things and only takes orders from the Chief of Staff. This man was Israel's Chief of Staff at the time. He's an Iranian-born man. His name is Shalom Mofaz. And here he is at the Pentagon in January 2002, meeting with some of his fellow men in the Pentagon, men that see eye to eye with him. Paul Wolfowitz, to his right. On his left, Douglas Feith. And across the table from him is Dov Zakheim. And there's another Israeli at the wall. I can't see the other men. But what are they talking about? He's advising the American, these civilians who do the policy board at the Pentagon, how they should respond to 9/11. What was the plan? Here's the plan. 7 countries in 5 years. As Wesley Clark said, about 10 days after 9/11, he went to the Pentagon and saw Rumsfeld and Wolfowitz, and one of the generals called him into his office and said, "We've made the decision, we're going to war with Iraq." And Wesley Clark said, "We're going to war with Iraq? Why?" "I don't know," the general said. He came back a few weeks later. By then we were bombing Afghanistan. He said, "Are we still going to war with Iraq?" And the general said, "Oh, sir, it's much worse than that. We're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq, then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off with Iran." As you can tell from where we are today, we've accomplished about half of that list by now. Well, where does this idea come from that we have to control the Middle East, we have to have a hegemonic power there? This is what David Ben-Gurion said. He's the founding prime minister of Israel. And he said, just 1 week after the creation of the State of Israel, after they claimed independence in May of 1948, he said, "We should prepare to go on the offensive with the aim of smashing Lebanon, Jordan, and Syria." Then he had a plan how to do it in Lebanon, and he says if the Egyptians don't accept it, we'll bomb them too. Why? Because the Israelis of the Likud, of the Irgun, these are the right-wing Israelis, have something what they call Eretz Israel. And Eretz Israel is the notion that the land of Israel, that is, theirs according to biblical narrative, stretches from the Euphrates River in Iraq to the Nile River in Egypt. And in between that is the Star of David. It's the Israeli flag. The 2 rivers and the star of the Rothschild star in the middle. And that's basically what the future borders of Israel will look like. And this is from an Israeli website called jewsnews.co.il. And that's the title of their article, and that's where the image comes from. It's actually, Eretz Israel, for some people, it extends beyond that. They claim Cyprus, they claim other parts of the... Now, how do they intend to become the hegemonic power in the Middle East? A small country like Israel, with a population of like 4 million, if you're counting honestly, how are they going to control the whole region, millions and millions of people? Balkanization. They want to break up the big secular nations like Iraq and Syria, break them up into their ethnic constituent parts. So like when you look at Iraq today, Iraq is now broken into 3 pieces: Kurdistan, Shiitestan, and Sunnistan. And as you see, Libya, they've already accomplished that. Without much ado, Libya is now fractured into pieces as well. Syria is now like Humpty Dumpty. It's fallen off the wall. You can't put it back together again. It'll be very hard. These countries will no longer exist as they used to be. This is called the Yinon Plan. Oded Yinon was the Israeli who wrote the essay about it. And the idea was to break up the big countries into ethnic statelets. That's what they did in Yugoslavia. It's also what they did in Russia, Soviet Union. So they began doing this in the 90s, and now they're applying it to the Middle East. And here is just an example of the ethnic constituencies of Syria and Iraq. So you can see how these countries are being broken. And the yellow area is basically Islamic State area now. That is the Sunni area. And of course, they're being funded by Saudi Arabia and Qatar, and Israel is helping them a lot. Britain and France, everybody wants, but we are now waging war against this group which we have been supporting. So it's like we created the boogeyman that we're now going to fight. Well, we've done that before. But interesting thing here is in the Yanon plan, it says that their goal is to break up these countries, but it says, while the dissolution of the military power of these states is our primary short-term target. Well, how do you break up the militaries of these countries? You attack them, and you bomb them, and you wage war against them. But not Israel. America did it. America's done it for it. We've done it for them. At great expense, mind you. You know, part of the reason why so many Americans are struggling now and there's very little largesse from the government is because we spend so much money on this project. Here's what the Middle East looks like according to the definition of the boundaries that we had after World War II. And this is something how it's going to look, you know, according to the Yanon plan, breaking the states up into pieces.
Turkey?
Yeah, Turkey. They don't have Turkey, but Turkey loses some land there, as you see. You know, it's got the Kurdish area in the southeast. Now, are the terrorists winning the war on terror? It seems like they are. This just shows you that since 2000, the frequency of attacks and the number of attacks has increased tenfold. So we've spent a lot of money on the war on terror, but it's been extremely counterproductive. So now, you know, last year alone in Iraq, 20,000 people were killed just due to terrorism. And as I said, at great expense. The green bars indicate that what the 300 billion, which was the year 2000, we were spending on defense, 300 billion per year. Now it's doubled. So that's roughly, it went from $1,000 for every man, woman, and child in this country to $2,000 for every man, woman, and child in this country per year. We're spending more money on defense than basically all the other NATO countries put together. Now, I talked about the Likud, and Mr. Netanyahu is the chairman of the Likud and has been the chairman for a long time. What is the Likud? Well, I have to give you a little bit of history about Zionism here. The Likud was created by the man in the middle, Menachem Begin, and the man on the right, Yitzhak Shamir. And they were former terrorists. They were terrorist heads of the Irgun and the Stern gang in the 30s and 40s in Palestine. They were notorious terrorists who did terrible things. But in the 1970s, they created the Likud coalition, and they brought all of their former terrorist buddies into a political party of the extreme right. And their political ideology is based on something called revisionist Zionism, which is basically the Zionism of Zev Jabotinsky. And that's probably more than you need to understand about this. I mean, but Mr. Jabotinsky is this guy from Odessa who died in 1940, who said that the relationship between the Israelis and the Palestinians has to be one in which the Israelis use brutal force to suppress these people. He often uses the word iron, using iron fist, iron brain, iron wall. And Jabotinsky called for building an iron wall between the Israelis and the Palestinians, which is exactly what Mr. Sharon did starting in 2002, 2003. They began the construction of the fence. Now, across the Holy Land, there's this god-awful wall that's twice as high as the Berlin Wall and 40 times longer. You know, if we thought the Berlin Wall was bad, you should see the wall in Bethlehem.
How do you spell that guy's name?
Jabotinsky. Jabotinsky. Jabotinsky.
The sad thing about that wall is that most Americans don't know about it.
Right. Right. Well, here's the emblem of the Irgun, which was the organization that Mr. Begin was head of. And this is their emblem. So you see in the emblem, you see the Eretz Israel there. That's the map that I told you about. And in Hebrew it says underneath that, Rakach, only thus, with guns, will they achieve what they want to achieve. Here's, in 1948, here's Mr. Begin. He was born in Russia. He came to Palestine in 1942. He joined the Irgun and became the leader. And in 1946, he ordered the bombing of the King David Hotel, which was headquarters for the British Mandate, British headquarters. And he created the Likud then in 1973. And in 1977, he became prime minister. This is the time when I lived in Israel. All of this happened when I was living in Israel in the 70s. And when he came to power, my Israeli girlfriend cried. And she said, this is the death of Israel. This is the terrorists have taken over. because the Labor Party that had been running Israel basically since its creation had now been ousted, and the terrorist guys came into power. And sure enough, he became prime minister. The next year he invaded Lebanon, putting into effect exactly what Ben-Gurion had said, that we have to go to Lebanon and create a Christian statelet in the south. And that's when American troops went there the first time, remember? Reagan sent American troops to Beirut, and 173 of them were killed in a big car bomb. Another false flag terror. And then in 1982, he invaded Lebanon with a vengeance, and at least 20,000 Lebanese people were killed. It's interesting that when that car bomb went in Beirut and killed those Americans at the Marine barracks, that the Israelis knew the exact truck and the license number and the type of truck that it was, but they only gave the Americans the skinniest of information. They said, you may be exposed to a truck bomb in the near future. But they knew exactly what truck it was. They knew it was being made and everything. So here's the handiwork of Mr. Begin when he ordered the bombing of the King David Hotel, in which 93 people died in 1946. It was the worst act of terrorism in Israeli-Palestinian history, by the way, the destruction of that hotel. And it's interesting, 50 years later, in 2006, Mr. Netanyahu spoke at a celebration. They had a celebration. All the terrorists came to the King David Hotel, what they've rebuilt, and they were happy. And they talked about what they did and how it went, and they cheered and everything like that. And it was revealed in the Israeli press and in this conference that the Haganah was also involved in that, which is interesting to know because the Haganah is often seen as the good guys, but that was under David Ben-Gurion. But they were also involved in bombing the King David Hotel. So they were all involved in terrorism. And here we have the wanted posters from the British authorities in Palestine in the main mandate period. And you see Mr. Begin is a wanted terrorist, Mr. Shamir is a wanted terrorist. And in that terrorist group that Mr. Shamir was head of, called the Stern Gang, or Lehi, Rahm Emanuel's father was a member of that. Rahm Emanuel was the former senior advisor to Bill Clinton during the entire time that Clinton was in office. Then he was the first person that Barack Obama appointed. Barack Obama appointed him chief of staff. First appointment. And his father is a man named Benjamin Auerbach, who changed his name to Emanuel. And he was a member of that most radical terrorist group in Palestine, the Stern Gang. How do you spell that? Stern, S-T-E-R-N. The Stern Gang, also known as Lehi. It's an acronym, L-E-H-I. Well, here is Mr. Begin, and he was interviewed by a British journalist in 1974, and he was asked, how does it feel in light of all that's going on to be the father of terrorism in the Middle East? And Mr. Menachem Begin said, in the Middle East? In all the world. So he was, giving himself the applause or the accolade of being the father of terrorism in the whole world, which in fact he is. He was. He's not exaggerating. He's proud of it, though. And you see, there's Mr. Netanyahu. Mr. Netanyahu is just the next generation of these terrorists, Israeli terrorists. Here's Mr. Shamir, Yitzhak Shamir. He has a son just like Mr. Netanyahu, who also is involved in 9/11 to a great extent. Yitzhak Shamir's group killed that man, Volker Bernadotte, who was the United Nations mediator to Palestine when they were trying to work out this partition plan in the late 40s. And the Israelis didn't like what Mr. Bernadotte was going to do. Mr. Bernadotte wanted to stick to the plan that Jerusalem would be a third independent city-state with access for everybody. The Israelis didn't want that. They wanted Jerusalem. So they had to kill Mr. Bernadotte. And Shamir went on to run an operation where they were killing German scientists who were working with Egypt. And Shamir was running this assassination program of German scientists. He was the guy who was running it. And when David Ben-Gurion put a stop to this killing of the massacre, the killing of these German scientists, Mr. Shamir resigned from the Mossad because the Director General of the Mossad, who was behind this terrorist plan, had been fired. This is that man, Isser Harel. Isser Harel was basically the first chief of Mossad, the first chief of Shin Bet, another Israeli intelligence group. security in the state. And he was asked in 1980 by an American Zionist, he said, "Do you think terrorism will come to America? And if so, where and why?" And Mr. Harrell says, "Yes, they're going to attack you. You know, they want to do that. Arab money buys more than tents." And asked about where it would happen, Mr. Harrell, the former head of the Mossad, said, "New York City is a symbol of freedom and capitalism. It's likely they will strike the Empire State Building, your tallest building, and a symbol of your power." So this was a prediction coming from the chief of the Mossad in 1980 to a man named Michael Evans. Well, in order to make, turn this dream or this prediction into reality, two of his chief Mossadniks, these are the guys that served under Issa Harel from the old time. These are the guys who kidnapped Eichmann in Argentina. These are the guys who smuggled plutonium to Israel. These are two of the biggest guys under Issa Harel. And these two guys came to New York City, and they represented a company called Atwell Security of Tel Aviv. And Atwell Security of Tel Aviv tried to get the security contract for the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, which meant that if they got the security contract for the Port Authority, they would be in charge of security of New York's bridges, ports, tunnels, airports, harbors, and the World Trade Center. Well, it turned out that somebody at the Port Authority discovered that the man on the bottom, Shalom Ben-Dor, had been using a false name. He was using a different name. And when they found out that he was actually convicted of murder in Israel, they tore up the contract, which was a wise move. Had the Port Authority not torn up that contract in 1987, 9/11 would have happened at least 10 years earlier, which is what the plan was. 9/11 was supposed to happen in the 1980s, or at latest in the early 1990s. But it was delayed a little bit, but only a little bit. Because what they did is those guys that I just showed you, those two Mossadniks, they went to work for Kroll, Jules Kroll, the man on the top here, who was a business partner with Maurice Greenberg. You probably remember who Maurice Greenberg is. AIG. He was the chairman of AIG, the company that received $180 billion in the bailout of 2008-2009. AIG is an insurance company.
Did they insure the World Trade Center also?
Well, I don't know. They didn't insure. I don't know about the World Trade Center, but they insured Goldman Sachs and Bank of America and all their dodgy dealings, and they basically insured their profits. And when those banks lost money, AIG made them whole with taxpayer money. So the $180 billion went to Maurice Greenberg, and then it went right to Goldman Sachs and Bank of America, Wells Fargo, what have you. Well, that Israeli man who was the head of Atwell Security, who had killed those Palestinians or ordered the killing of these Palestinians, then went to work for Jules Kroll, the man on the top. And in 1993, Jules Kroll got the security contract for the World Trade Center. And so he was in charge of rewriting, the Kroll Associates were in charge of rewriting security procedures for the World Trade Center, starting in 1993. And they were the company in charge of security at the World Trade Center through to 2001. The person who was the CEO of Kroll Associates when 9/11 happened is this man. His name is Michael Cherkasky. And in 1993, he was the head of the investigations division for DA Robert Morgenthau in New York City. And so he led the investigation in New York of what happened in 1993 at the World Trade Center when the FBI, working with some other people in a sting operation, exploded a bomb in the basement. And so after he worked on the investigation of the crime, which was, of course, another false flag, then he joined Jules Kroll at the World Trade Center and ran security. So then in 2001, he was the CEO of the company, and as this is Kroll Associates, who had complete security contract for the World Trade Center. And in September 2001, that security was evidently, seriously compromised. You had people in the World Trade Center putting in explosives, during the day-to-day life of the World Trade Center. And this is another Kroll Associates man here, is Jerome Hauer, and he was the person who built the Office of Emergency Management, the hardened bunker on the 23rd floor of Building 7. That's the third tower that fell at 5:20 in the afternoon on 9/11. And in that hardened bunker on that day is probably the place where the masterminds of the demolition of the World Trade Center were pulling the levers and pushing the buttons. Because it stands to reason when you're doing such a big demolition project, you have to have somebody there. You have to see what's going on. You have to see what needs to be done. And the idea, I call this the ideation, in 1978. This is when the first time that the idea of a plane flying into a high-rise building was put out in a film. This film was made by an Israeli agent named Arnon Milchan. Arnon Milchan is the guy who made JFK and Brazil, a bunch of movies in Hollywood. He's received a couple Oscars in the last couple of years. But this is his first film called Medusa Touch, in which a 747 crashes into a high-rise tower. Made this in England and France. And that's the cover of the film. And in the same year that he made this film, here he's speaking with the Israel Defense Minister Ezer Weizmann. And he's very close to these people. Arnon Milchan is an Israeli millionaire who comes from a family that is very highly connected to the Zionist leadership of Israel. And he's also their biggest nuclear smuggling agent. He, for example, oversaw the smuggling of 800 nuclear triggers from the United States to Israel in the 1980s. He, however, was not indicted in the investigation, but all of the men who worked for him went to jail. So here he is. You see, he's very highly connected. So that's how you avoid getting a conviction. But you're very highly connected. Here he is between his two friends, and he's said now to be worth $5.2 billion. The second wealthiest, they say, the second wealthiest Hollywood mogul. But he also has a very long history of money laundering. He's been money laundering for the state of Israel and also for the state of South Africa. So you have to ask, well, you have $5.2 billion, but where did the money come from? Whose money are you playing with? Well, Ideation 2000. This is a movie that was made in 2000 in which a 757 or 767 is flown into the World Trade Center. And this movie was made with Arnon Milchan and his partner, Rupert Murdoch, made this film. Rupert Murdoch produced this episode. It's a spin-off from the X-Files. And in this movie, which was shown on TV in March 2001, what happened is that the plane is flying to the World Trade Center, to New York, and it is hijacked remotely while on autopilot. So the pilot has lost control of the plane, but he doesn't even know it. And the plane is flying directly at the World Trade Center. And at the very last minute, they're able to avoid hitting the South Tower, or the North Tower. This is another form of ideation, or putting the idea out there. This was an article that was published a couple years before 9/11 called Catastrophic Terrorism, in which the authors said that, these nightmare scenarios, and catastrophic terrorism has moved from being a far-fetched horror to a contingency that could happen next month. This was written by Ashton Carter, John Deutsch, and Philip Zelikow. And in this article, they laid out for the intelligentsia in America that we're going to have catastrophic terrorism in this country. They're imagining, imagining the transforming event, the event that will change America. And this is the kind of article that is read in the halls of power in Washington, D.C., and by professors at universities across America. But who are these men? Ashton Carter is today the Secretary of Defense. He's worked for Rothschild for the last 20, 30 years. He's worked for the Rothschilds. And Philip Zelikow, as you know, was the man who wrote the narrative that we've been given about 9/11. So first he was imagining the transforming event. Then when it happened, he created the narrative for us to understand what happened. But it's all lies. Here it shows Ashton Carter and John Deutsch when they were partners, senior partners of Global Technology Partners, which is an exclusive affiliate of Rothschild North America. So they're getting paid by the Rothschilds as they imagine this transforming event that's going to change American history. And their company, when the Rothschilds bought into it, it's a company that basically facilitates the investment or the acquisition of companies that make money selling defense products. Another one of the people who are involved in this ideation is the Kagan family down here in the bottom. This is Donald Kagan and his sons Robert and Fred, and Robert's wife is the woman. Her name is Victoria Nuland. She's Assistant Secretary of State, you probably know, who brought us the crisis in Ukraine, single-handedly, basically. And what they did is that the Kagans had this little group called the Project for the New American Century, which they came up with in the year 2000. And they had a bunch of people sign on to these documents that they put out there. And a very important document was one called Rebuilding America's Defenses, which came out in September 2000, in which they basically said that America has to have full spectrum dominance of the whole planet. And in order for the United States to have that, we would need to have troops and bases in Iraq, whether Saddam Hussein was in power or not. That's where we are today. And these people at the top, these are the basic neocons who all signed on to these documents and these ideas. So remember that during the presidential debate in the year 2000, this is one of the questions that came up to people like George Bush. Do you believe when you become president, will you support regime change? Because people who had read these documents knew that was in the cards. Here's Philip Zelikow, the man who wrote the 9/11 Commission report, the official myth. Actually, he studied at college, I think at Rice University, his thesis was how to create and maintain the public myth. So that the public gets this myth that they can believe in. And using that myth, they will then have their understanding, albeit fake, false, of the world.
That was his college thesis?
Yeah, it's I think his doctoral thesis, yeah, at Rice University. So reality, we shift to reality here. 2001, obviously aircraft that looked like they were remotely controlled crashed into the Twin Towers. I want to point your attention to that white-hot burning object. Can you see that white-hot burning object that's flying out past the pole? The pole there in the foreground? That's burning white-hot. These are some photographs from videos and photographs that show the plane hitting the South Tower. And this was a very strange plane because it appeared to have a missile pod on the fuselage. And as the plane approached the building, when it was 50 feet away from the building, which is milliseconds for a plane going 500 miles an hour, 400 miles an hour, it apparently fired some missile from that pod, which then goes faster than the plane and impacts the tower just before the plane strikes it. Well, that's not a passenger plane. Here you see the hardware on the bottom of the plane. It's got a gray belly and it's got a groove on the bottom, which is not what you would expect to see on United Airlines Flight 175 either. And that groove is more indicative of a 767 tanker aircraft that's been converted. But here's what that missile did. That object that was fired, this is from a video. This shows that just before the plane struck the tower, this is the South Tower, that there was this white-hot hole that had been opened up, open sesame, into the building, which facilitated the entry of the fuselage. The fuselage of the plane is rather weak, actually. It's aluminum clad, and in order for that fuselage to penetrate that building, the missile opened up a hole. But if that was created by a DU warhead, which I think it was, the evidence seems to indicate that means that warhead that hit the building, it was white hot. It was white hot when it was flying in air because it's pyrophoric. But then it opened up the hole in the building. Then it created an intensely superheated environment inside that building as it passed through. So anything that's on that floor is going to explode. If there's any sort of explosives in there, anything combustible, it'll burn instantly. Which is exactly what happened. The plane went in there, and all the kerosene, the jet fuel that was on the plane, combusted immediately. So basically, all of the fuel on the plane burned within the first few seconds of impact. And here you see those two objects coming out of the tower. You see there's one that's burning with a gray cloud of smoke behind it, and then there's this white-hot object. And what's interesting about the white-hot object is that it's so hot that the oxides that are following behind it only become visible when they get a little bit cooler. That's why there's a gap there. That's what uranium warheads do. And I asked a scientist from a Livermore lab who I did a lot of work with on depleted uranium, and I showed him these photographs and I said, Marianne, can you tell me, does this object have the characteristics of a burning warhead, uranium warhead? He said, yes, it does.
Where's the contamination?
Contamination?
From the uranium?
We'll get to that. The white hot object is certainly not part of the aircraft because it's burning too hot and it's coming out. If you look at the videos, if you go home and you look at the video of the impact of the plane hitting look and see what comes out the other side of the building. You'll see that these objects are coming out with great momentum. Great momentum. Nothing slowed them down. This is the entry wound, and as you can see that there was an explosion coming out the entry wound where the plane went in. Here you see, as the explosion is happening, you see that the first things that explode created a white smoke. White smoke like this is indicative of thermite. Thermite packages, for example, large amounts of thermite on the floor, because when thermite reacts, it creates a white smoke and a molten metal, like iron, for example, and incredible heat. Here again, you see that there was an incredible combustion and explosions occurring at impact. Now, here you can see the difference between the different colors of smoke. The explosion coming out the entry wound is mostly whitish and very dense, different color flame. The kerosene on the left, on the right, excuse me, is the sooty smoke with a darker flame. That's burning kerosene. Here's the North Tower when it was struck. And when the North Tower was struck, we have the same sort of thing. By the way, both planes flew into secure computer rooms. That's very important. They didn't fly into offices. They didn't fly into rooms with desks and people working. They flew into computer rooms that were secure, where all you had were large banks of servers and batteries and things like that. And this was the computer room of Jules Kroll and Maurice Greenberg. The first plane went into their computer room. They're in charge of security, remember? The first plane went right into their computer room, and their computer room was on the north and east side of Building 1. And that's exactly where we see these explosions coming out. The explosions aren't coming out the west side. The east side has an explosion coming out the side of the building, which is primarily white. Quite unusual. The Pentagon, as we talked about earlier, there's no evidence of a plane striking the Pentagon. And had the plane come in at grade level, which is just on top of the grass, it would have hit these cable spools that were out there that are about 2.5 meters high. But they're not, and you see, this is before the building collapsed. There is no evidence of a plane or anything like it. And when you consider that the outside wall of the Pentagon is 1 meter thick masonry and concrete, it stands to reason that a plane would have left some of its debris on the lawn. This is the hole that was that this object, whatever hit the Pentagon, it bored through all these walls and came out here and left this pile of stuff. But this is from the document about what happened to the Pentagon. And as you can see, there are columns. Those are those little colored squares there. There are columns between where the plane supposedly entered and the hole. And some of those columns are still standing. So it clearly, the plane did not create that hole. Something smaller and more intense wove its way through that and made that hole. Like the warhead of a missile. And you can see that it was very intensely hot. We don't know what caused this hole, but the engineers were not allowed. The engineers who went to the Pentagon were not allowed to visit this part of the Pentagon. This area was boarded off, and only FBI agents could go there. And so this photograph is courtesy of the FBI, the small text on the side there. And at the Pentagon, they knew there was contamination, like the man asked, contamination. At the Pentagon, they knew very well that the area was most likely very toxic. So they went in with respirators like this, and when they came out, they were decontaminated. There were decontamination units that sprayed off their shoes and washed their clothes and stuff, because they knew that whatever hit the Pentagon had left toxic residue behind. This is the South Tower just before it collapsed. Basically, 7 minutes before it collapsed, we see an active thermetic reaction occurring on the 81st floor. This is the east corner where the plane came out. And you see the sparkler, all that sparkling that's going on the 81st floor is indicative of a thermetic reaction occurring. And some of the evidence of that is that white smoke that's coming out from that window. That pure white smoke you see there, That's the aluminum oxide that is produced by a reaction of that sort. It's extremely hot, and what it produces molten iron. And what happened is that then for the next 7 minutes, there was a cascade, a virtual waterfall of molten iron that fell from the 81st floor. But the federal government, the people who investigated this, said, we didn't see any molten metal. There's no molten metal there. What are you talking about? Well, it was on TV. There's videos of it, just tons of it, tons of it. 1 cubic meter of molten iron weighs something like 6.5 tons. So it's a lot of molten iron we're talking about there. Very heavy amount of stuff. Here's another. This is evidence of a cutter charge. You see the middle firefighter that's kind of looking at our way. He's standing in front of a box column that has clearly been cut with a cutter charge at a 45-degree angle. And that means that when it's cut, these box columns are what held up the Twin Towers. Each building had a core section in which 47 of these box columns were where the elevators were. And that's what held up the towers. Not the peripheral columns, not the columns that are on the perimeter of the building, but the core columns. And in order for the buildings to fall, all 47 columns would have to be cut at the same time. And that means that these cutter charges would have to be hooked up to some sort of computer system so that they would all go off at the same time, so that they would just break and slide down like that, and the building would fall. That's what happened. Because you have to understand that both towers fell at basically free fall speed. They both fell the entire way down in about 11 seconds. Here is Shanksville, the mystery of Shanksville, and we're told that a Boeing 757 or 767, a big Boeing aircraft, went into a hole 20 feet across and 6 feet deep. And the coroner who went to this, who was in charge of this, Wally Miller, he said he stopped being a coroner after 20 minutes because there was no body there. And the mayor said there was no plane parts there. So there's no plane, there's no bodies. What happened here? Well, as we know, the actual debris field is about a quarter-mile further into the woods there. And this was just a distraction. We're told the plane went here, which is just a ruse. It's like what a stage magician will say, look here, don't look there. It's a ruse. We were tricked. Just like that Israeli guy said, terrorist theater. You've been deceived. Molten metal was found in the rubble in great amounts, and this just shows you that as they pulled stuff from the pile, they were coming upon pieces of iron and pieces of metal that were literally melting.
Where are you now?
This is World Trade Center. This is World Trade Center. This is they're pulling stuff off the rubble pile. They're removing the debris.
Shanksville, though, you said the debris was somewhere else.
Yes, the debris was further in the woods. The debris was in the woods.
Pictures of that?
There are some. On my website, I recently found one, an early Pittsburgh newspaper or television channel had their helicopter over there. And they're flying over the woods, and they're saying, here's the crash site, and you see a lot of little white things on the ground. You don't see any big parts of a plane. And I'll talk about that more, but that's the 9 acres where they were doing the removal of the debris in the woods around the cabins of the Hoover family. And this is one of the who works for the NIST. NIST is part of the Department of Commerce. And his name is John Gross. And in the year 2006, he was interviewed, or he was giving a presentation in Texas. And somebody said, can you talk about the molten metal that was found in the basement? Because I wrote about it in 2002. This man said, well, let's go back to your basic premise that there was a pool of molten steel. I know absolutely nobody. No eyewitness said so. Nobody's produced it. Complete lies. Because these firefighters saw it, and there you have a picture on the bottom which shows clearly a pool of molten iron. But NIST, you see, they were writing a cover-up, and because molten iron does not fit into their myth, they have to reject it. So any evidence that contradicts the myth has to be rejected. This is the characteristic, it's called the signature characteristic of the dust of the World Trade Center. It is that 6%, at least 6% of the dust of the World Trade Center is metal droplets, metal balls like this. These are tiny iron balls. And that is what is found in all of the dust of the World Trade Center. You see how frequently they're found. Those little round balls there. They're smaller than 1 millimeter in size. They're very tiny. But that's not all that was found. This was also from the U.S. Geological Survey of the Dust, but it did not get published in the report. The engineers were able to get this through one of those Freedom of Speech or Freedom of Information Acts. This is molybdenum. This little tiny sphere is molybdenum, which has the 4th highest melting temperature on the periodic table. So this gives you an idea that the destruction of the World Trade Center was a very hot event. That should help you to understand that when Judy Wood says that the destruction of the World Trade Center was a cold event, she's not being honest with you. It was anything but cold. This melting temperature of this molybdenum is 4,753 degrees Fahrenheit. Furthermore, for 3 months until Christmas, the rubble pile at ground zero was so hot that it was producing nanoparticles in the smoke. The smoke was being monitored on a roof by a drum, a Davis drum from the University of California at Davis. And when the smoke blew through that drum, they could analyze the size of the particles and the contents of the particles. And what they found is that most of the particles were nanoparticles, which means that they're extremely, extremely small, smaller than 1/10 of a micron in diameter. That's a millionth of a meter, smaller than that. Which means that if you inhale these particles, if you are so unfortunate to be on this pile or near this pile, and if you get a whiff of this smoke in your lungs, those particles will go, they won't stop in your throat, they won't stop in your lungs, they will pass through all of the tissue until they get to the nucleus of the cell. And when they get to the nucleus of the cell, they embed themselves there, and they start wreaking havoc with the human system. And you get cancer, Parkinson's, whatever, mitochondrial diseases, because when you get to the nucleus of the cell and you start mucking around there, you cause serious damage, which is why 1,600 of the firefighters have perished, like this man. I don't know if this man's perished, but he's walking on the pile. Remember how those guys were at the Pentagon with those respirators and everything? The guys in New York had no such luck. The guys in New York walked on the pile, worked on the pile, and breathed the smoke. I know some of these people. There was a girl who was on the tour with me in Europe, Rachel. She just brought sandwiches down to the workers. She was being a good person. She was bringing sandwiches and drinks to these people who were working on the pile. And she breathed the smoke. And her health has been completely a wreck ever since. They're hanging on for life. Many of them have died. This is some of the published evidence of testimonies of people who felt and saw explosions inside the tower before they fell. The first one is Louis Caccioli. He said we were going up to the 24th floor to evacuate workers. On the last trip up, a bomb went off. We think there were bombs set in the building. And another one was a worker who came down here. There was another explosion. There's a lot of eyewitnesses, people who worked in the tower, like William Rodriguez, the janitor from the North Tower, who experienced explosions in the towers, in the basements, in the sub-basement, before the plane even hit the building. But none of that got into the official record. I wonder why. Here you see, as most people can understand, that this is an explosive event. If this is a collapse of a tower, you're not going to have pieces of steel and debris thrust with great energy laterally. It's just not going to happen. Things will fall down. So whatever is blowing this debris outward, whatever is crushing the debris and then blowing it outwards, is coming from energy in the center of the building. Now another weird thing that happened on 9/11 was the U.S. Customs House, which is the building in the center here between these two towers. It is on the left is Larry Silverstein's tower, one building down further. You can see some of its windows at the top there. And this building is between Larry Silverstein's building number 7 and North Tower number 1. This building is about, I think, 8 stories high with several sub-basements. But this building was toast before either tower collapsed. Something happened to the U.S. Customs House that nobody wants to talk about. And you can see by the street here, the street is quite clean, quite normal. That means that neither tower has collapsed yet. Because when the towers collapsed, the streets looked radically different. So here you see, there's the building we're talking about. And this image isn't so very sharp, but if you look at the north face of the building, which is to the left, you'll see about a third of the way down the building that the whole front of the building is blown out. So whatever hit this building really did a number on it. As you can see from this infrared photo, the building we're talking about is the one with the big hole in the middle. That's Building 6, U.S. Customs House. In the basement of this building, which is where this hole goes down to, there was a vault. And that vault was for evidence. That vault was for evidence for big federal cases being prosecuted by the federal government. So their evidence vault was hit. And there was a FEMA videographer named Kurt Sonnenfeld, who was the only videographer who was allowed to go in through all these buildings and take videos for FEMA. And he went down here in the basement and he saw that the vault doors had been broken open, they'd been cracked open, and he looked in the vault and he saw the vault was empty. This man now lives in fear of his life in Argentina. His wife was murdered in Colorado and he's been blamed for it. Although the Colorado authorities said he didn't do it, it's a suicide. Well, as we now go to the next phase, 9/11 happened, but there was a cover-up that followed. And it's the cover-up and the deception that is the ongoing crime. And as Richard Nixon said, it's not the crime that gets you, it's the cover-up. The first cover-uppers in order of importance would be these two characters. John Ashcroft, Attorney General of the United States in charge of DOJ, Justice, and his assistant, Michael Chertoff, an Israeli national, a dual national, who was in charge of the criminal division of the Department of Justice. So it fell into the lap of Mr. Chertoff to investigate the crime of 9/11. But as you know, there was no investigation. There was no investigation of 9/11, there was no prosecution. Because what the government said is they said, it's an act of war. It's not a crime, it's an act of war. Therefore, we won't investigate. We're at war with 19 Arabs. And as you see here, for day-to-day decisions, Chertoff has the last word. So, this is important because when we're talking about destruction of evidence, there's a chain of custody. He is the top cop. Ashcroft was the top cop. Chertoff was the top cop for 9/11. He allowed the evidence to be destroyed. That's a crime. And here he was when he was made Secretary of Homeland Security in 2005. And in this position, he maintained his control over access to the evidence of 9/11. And here's Philip Zelikow. He used to be the advisor, the legal advisor to Condoleezza Rice. And they're meeting with Ehud Olmert here, Israeli Prime Minister. And Zelikow said something very interesting. Prior to the war in Iraq, he said that when talking about Iraqi weapons of mass destruction, he said, I'll tell you what I think the real threat is, and actually has been since 1990. It's the threat against Israel. So he's admitting that the Iraqi weapons of mass destruction, if they even existed, posed no threat to the United States or Britain. They posed a threat to Israel, which is why people like Wolfowitz wanted to go to war with Iraq right away. Well, Zelikow, as I said, wrote the 9/11 Commission report. In fact, he wrote it before the staff started writing it themselves. He had all the bullet points lined up. He had the entire myth constructed. Then he just picked and chose the pieces that would fit into that narrative. Another person who's a key part of the cover-up is this man, Gene Corley. He oversaw the production of this document, the Building Performance Study. He was in charge of that. Prior to doing this report, he had also done a similar report on Waco, Texas, and Oklahoma City. So his specialty is kind of like producing documents that support the government's version. And I called him up. He's from Illinois. I called him up. He's a concrete specialist. And I asked him, Mr. Corley, are you doing any tests on the metal to determine if the explosions have occurred, if there's any evidence of explosions? Because I know that steel leaves a telltale trace of any explosions. He says, I don't know anything about that. He says, I'm not a metallurgist. So you might ask, why is a person who knows nothing about metal investigating the collapse of two of the largest metal frame buildings in the world? And then NIST went on to create this report, the final report on the collapse of the World Trade Centers. It was published in 2005. And it was published under this man who was the director. His name is William Jeffrey, formerly Jaffe. And he was the director when they issued this report, in which they did not investigate the steel for explosions or any evidence of explosives or molten metal or anything like that. This was a whitewash. This report is a complete whitewash of, but this man certainly knows about things like nanothermite because he is now the head of a company that makes these things. It's actually not a company, it's a tax-exempt, what do you call, a research and development lab in California called Stanford Research Institute, SRI. And it's in Menlo Park, and they are a nonprofit. That's what they are. They're a nonprofit who does research and development for the U.S. military, and they create nanocomposites, nanothermite, just like we found in the World Trade Center. And in fact, the person who's in charge of the lab where they make those things is this Israeli man here, Mr. Bloom, who's been working and making nanocomposites in Menlo Park since 1984. This is what we're talking about. This is a bilayered nanocomposite. That means it's composed of particles in the nano size, very, very small. So what that basically means is that if you're talking about thermite, thermite, when it's in its granular form, is an incendiary. They used it when they bombed Dresden, for example, and they used it when in James Bond book when they burned down hotels because they said it leaves no traces. It's an incendiary. But when you mix the same elements or the same chemicals on a nano level, then you're basically putting them together molecule by molecule. So the surface area of the reaction is infinitesimally greater, which means that the reaction happens much faster with a lot more boom. But the boom is that the red layer is the thermetic layer. The red layer is the aluminum and the iron oxide. The gray layer contains organic compounds which then create the gas. This is what was found in the dust of the World Trade Center. At first they thought it was paint. But when they heated the paint, when they heated these little chips, these are the chips, when they heated them up to 430 degrees, they went boom. And they yielded more energy per gram than any known explosive. The result would be a little tiny ball of iron, great heat, like 2,500 degrees Celsius, and a little bit of a puff of white smoke. This is just to give you an example of the potential, the energy potential. The top 4 bars represent the energy potential of an aluminum thermite reaction. The first one is molybdenum trioxide. The one that's AlMO3 up there, that's molybdenum trioxide. That may very well be what produced those little balls of molybdenum. It stands to reason. The bottom 4 bars are high explosives that are used in normal demolition. And as you can see, the energy potential of these metal oxidizers is much higher. These thermites are much stronger, much more powerful. And this is coming to us directly from the DoD Energetics Center. This is coming straight from the guys who make this stuff. This is what pulverized the floors. Each building had an acre-sized floor, 110 of them, 4 inches thick of concrete poured into 20-gauge steel pans. All of those floors and all of those pans basically went up in smoke. In dust. And that's the dust. That's what the dust was rolling through the streets of Manhattan. And this dust was very hot. So if there was a lot of molten metal in this cloud, for example, when it hit a car, one side of the car would be toast, the other side of the car would be cool. This is what gives you those cars that Judy Wood talks about. This is very hot. William Rodriguez, for example, is just outside the North Tower, hiding under a fire truck, which is just outside the front door of the building. Just outside the front door of the North Tower. The whole North Tower pulverized around him. It didn't squish his truck. He survived. But he said when that dust came in, it burned his leg. And you see, this is the pulverization of the World Trade Center. All that was left, according to the people who picked up the mess, all that was left was dust and steel. That's it. There was nothing else. There were no tables, no computers, no chairs, no human remains. Very, very, very few human remains were found. Everything was pulverized. Now, when such a crime happens, and you want to cover it up, there are 3 things you have to control. You have to control the investigation and the access to the evidence. You have to control the interpretation, how the event is interpreted to the public. That's like the media and the government, what they tell you. The third thing is you have to control the litigation. You have to control the wrongful death suits that come up. There were 3,000 families that lost somebody that day. So there were a lot of people who had standing in wrongful death cases. Well, the government made sure that the first 2,900 families, settled out of court. They offered them money. There were then 96 families left who they didn't want the government money, they wanted to know what happened, who dropped the ball. And all of the tort litigation, all the 9/11 litigation went through this man's courtroom. His name is Alvin K. Hellerstein. He's the U.S. judge in the District of New York City. And there's a conflict of interest here that I discovered, and I tried to explain it to people that they could understand that this conflict of interest was put their cases in great peril. The fact is that his son lives in Israel on a settlement and is a lawyer, and his son's company represents the key defendant in the trial that his father is overseeing. That's a conflict of interest of the primary family member. That's not on. But the New York Times wouldn't go anywhere with this. I proved it. I wrote about it, time and time and time again. I let everybody know. They even took it to one of the families took it to the Supreme Court.
What's ICTS?
ICTS is International Consultants on Targeted Security. That is the company based in Holland that owned Huntley USA. Huntley USA was the company that was screening the passengers who were getting on the plane that day. So these families wanted to know, how did these 19 guys get on the plane? And so ICTS was in the dock. They were actually the key defendant. And the judge excused them towards the end of the trial. They never went to the trial, but at the end of the process, he said, I don't understand why this company is even here. You're just a parent company. You're just a parent company. You shouldn't be here. You can go home. Oh, we'll get about that. We can talk. Let's ask questions at the end. We're almost done now. Here's the conflict of interest, some of the details. That's his son, Joe Hellerstein, up there, lives in Israel, lives on a settlement in the West Bank. He works for that company, Ami Polak Matalon. The company's Kuckerman. Kuckerman is owned by the Rothschild Group. Judge Hellerstein, his father down here in New York City, is overseeing the process, and his son's company represents that key defendant. And here, then when you had the 96 families left, these 96 families really wanted a trial. They wanted a trial. And Judge Hellerstein basically was waging a war of attrition against all 96 families. And the people who bought off these families one by one, the first man is Kenneth Feinberg. He's called the special master. He's always special master of these compensation funds, whatever happens. And he paid off the families one by one, the first 2,900 families. Then the remaining 100 were dealt with by Sheila Birnbaum down here. Now, what's important to understand here is that all these people that I'm showing you are very closely tied to the state of Israel at a high level. For example, Sheila Birnbaum is a partner at Skadden Arps, a law firm that represents Israel in the United States of America. And Kenneth Feinberg, his connection is through the United Israel Appeal and the Jewish Federation of Washington. This is the UJA is a group that funds the state of Israel from the United States.
What was our connection to the Jewish Federation of Washington?
Sheila Birnbaum?
Yeah.
No, I don't know. She might be that, but that was Kenneth Feinberg's wife and his side.
Oh.
Sheila Birnbaum is with Skadden Arps,
Okay,
and
so
Skadden Arps is, you just read about Skadden Arps, you'll see it's a very pro-Israeli law firm in the United States.
Okay, so it was Kenneth Feinberg's wife that
Yeah,
was part of it.
yeah. Kenneth Feinberg, he's in let's see. Yeah, Kenneth Feinberg was appointed by John Ashcroft. His wife, who worked with him, she was part of this operation. She is an executive member of the United Israel Appeal and the Jewish Federation of Washington, D.C. And she is also on the Board of Governors of the Jewish Agency. The Jewish Agency is like the highest Zionist agency in the United States, the Jewish Agency. That's pretty high. This man is Michael Mukasey, former Attorney General. He is the other, he belongs to the same congregation as Alvin K. Hellerstein. What's important about Mr. Mukasey is that he oversaw the process in 1993, 1994 about the first bombing of the World Trade Center, where they blamed the blind cleric from Egypt and all that. These guys got life in prison, while we know from reading the New York Times that the FBI was very much involved in the production and the creation of the truck that blew up. And that they had paid this Egyptian colonel $1 million to basically create this group of people to be part of a sting operation. And that's how the FBI does it nowadays. Nowadays, I call the FBI the Federal Bureau of Instigation, because they seem to be instigating a lot of the terrorism that's happening. Okay? And then he also oversaw the lawsuit between Larry Silverstein, the owner of the 3 buildings, and the insurance companies that had insured the property. And as you know, Larry Silverstein wound up getting double indemnity. He was paid for both towers as 2 separate events. So he doubled his money, thanks to Mr. Mukasey. Here is Mayor Bloomberg with Ehud Barak in Gaza, or outside Gaza, during Operation Cast Lead. So when the Israelis find themselves on the the losing end of world public opinion because they're doing something terrible like dropping white phosphorus on people in Gaza, Mayor Bloomberg would go there and hold hands and say, we support you all the way. Those Palestinians deserve white phosphorus. You know, you got to give it to them sometimes. And that's what was happening here.
When was this picture taken?
This is from that time. I think this is Operation Cast Lead. So what was that? 2008, Christmas time, 2008. Here he is meeting with Mr. Netanyahu. These guys are close. These guys are really, really close. Just so that you understand that, you know, when, for example, a missile landed by the airport in Tel Aviv, Mr. Mayor Bloomberg went on a plane directly to that airport and got off the plane and said, this is the most secure airport in the world, this is the best place to be, you know, that kind of stuff. Because the other airlines have said, we're not going to fly our airplanes into a place where it's getting hit by bombs. But here is going a little bit too fast here. Here is Mr. Netanyahu with Larry Silverstein. Now, if you remember, Mr. Netanyahu is basically the godfather of the war on terror, and Mr. Silverstein is like the godfather of 9/11. At least all three of his buildings are the ones that fell down. And what's interesting is that these two men had a very close relationship. Every Sunday afternoon, no matter where they were, they would have a conversation on the phone. And so this went on for years prior to 9/11. Every Sunday afternoon, they would speak to each other. What were they talking about? They were planning something big. Here's Mayor Bloomberg with Mr. Netanyahu showing him the memorial that was being built at Ground Zero just before it was completed in year 2011. But Mr. Netanyahu knows all about how the memorial would look because it was designed and built by an Israeli. It was built by Michael Arad. He's the young Israeli architect here who was the son of Moshe Arad. Moshe Arad was the former Israeli ambassador to the United States of America. And so, of all the people that they chose, that they could choose from to make who would be the architects of the memorial, they chose a friend of Netanyahu's. So as you can see that these Israelis have been involved in the 9/11 saga from the ideation back in the 70s, the preparation in the 80s, the carrying out in 2001, through to the legacy, the creation of the legacy. This is like, Ground Zero is like the Holocaust Museum is to what happened in World War II. It is the memorial of an event, or what they want you to think. And it's interesting that the lady who runs the memorial and the museum here at Ground Zero used to work at the Holocaust Museum. And here's Mr. Silverstein when he got the keys. He got the keys to the World Trade Center. He got the 99-year lease in July of 2001. And how did he get it? He got it through his friend, Louis Eisenberg. The two men served on the board of directors of the United Jewish Appeal. Mr. Silverstein was the chairman, national chairman of the UJA. That's the Federation of New York there, UJA Federation. And Lou Eisenberg was on the planning board of the same organization. So these men have this connection through their charity for Israel. And what happened is that Lou Eisenberg was the director, executive director of the Port Authority when the negotiations were going on for the privatization. And they made the privatization very difficult for Vornado Realty. So Vornado Realty, who should have gotten it, would have gotten it, walked away from the table, and it went to Larry Silverstein. Kind of the way that Obama got elected in Illinois. The other candidate dropped out, and it was a one-horse race. And here's Mr. Silverstein with his good friend Bloomberg. This was Mr. Silverstein's partner in the lease. This is Frank Lowy. He's an Israeli commando from the 40s. He was born in Czechoslovakia, and then in the early 50s, he moved to Australia and started a company of shopping malls, strip malls. And that company is now called Westfield. And they own many malls in the United States of America, Westfield. He had the retail space, the mall that was beneath the World Trade Center. So he owned the retail space, and Larry Silverstein owned the rental properties in the two towers. And Building 7. Building 7 belonged to Larry Silverstein. And here's the man who started the whole chain of events, the privatization of the World Trade Center. His name is Ronald Lauder. He's the son of Estee Lauder. And he's very close to the Mossad. He actually funds a school, I think it's called the Lauder School of Government, at the at the Interdisciplinary Center in Israel, in Herzliya. This is fundamentally, basically what I call Mossad U. The Mossad is based in Herzliya, and they have this school where their former heads of the Mossad have a college, and they teach things. And Lauder has a school there. And he's the one who oversaw the privatization. He was the director of Governor Pataki's privatization effort. And they decided, let's privatize the World Trade Center. Because you see, in order for their plan to go ahead, they needed to have control of the building. They couldn't have the building still be in public hands. They needed to have they needed to control the actual ownership of the building in order to make sure that their plot would go ahead. Here's Ehud Olmert, the former prime minister with Mr. Netanyahu. They are both members of the Likud. They're both from the Beitar, from the Likud. What's interesting is that the man on the left, Ehud Olmert, was in New York City on September 11th. He was the mayor of Jerusalem, which is a sister city of New York City. He was the deputy prime minister of Israel at the time, yet it was completely kept out of the news. In New York City, when such a high-level dignitary from Israel comes, it's usually on the front page of the news. They talk about it. But in this case, he came on September 10th. Nobody said a word. But I found out about it. And as we know, according to Mr. Madsen, that on September 11th, a Boeing 747 LL was allowed to leave from New York in the afternoon of September 11th at the explicit request and under the guidance of the U.S. Department of Defense. I suppose he was on that plane, along with a couple hundred other people. And here he was. He came back 10 days later and, put up this big show with with Giuliani and Senator McCain and talking about terrorism. But he never said, well, I was here on September 10th, it's funny. Never said anything like that. It was completely obscured. I found out about it by reading the sports page of the Jerusalem Post. And it was reported that on September 10th, he sold the Beitar, the football team of the Likud, to a couple of Israeli guys in New York City on September 10th, 2001. So we're coming to the end now, and this was the catastrophe that befell the United States on September 10th, September 11th, 2001. And I don't know what that little bright light is there, but it's kind of symbolic that out of such chaos and devastation, there is some hope. Because if you understand that 9/11 is a deception, and if you can pull it apart and realize who's behind it, why they did it, who they are, and what they're all about, then we can prevent things like this from happening in the future, and we can disengage ourselves from the deception that our nation has been deceived into believing is true for the last 14 years. And from that deception, they have taken us into this war on terror, which they promise will last for decades. Well, there's a way out of this. There's a way to get back to restore America, and that is to understand the deception and to reject it, and to tell others that we've been lied to. And that's what the 9/11 Truth Movement's all about. They want 9/11 Truth now. They want prosecutions. They want an investigation. And this is a growing movement in this country. I can tell you, it's a growing movement. I've been part of it since it started, and now it is reaching the young people and people of all walks of life are coming and realizing that 9/11 Truth is essential, because this is the seminal event of our time. And if we allow ourselves to be deceived about what 9/11 is, then we are letting our entire history be hijacked. And with that, I want to thank Brian and Henry and you all for coming. And if you have any questions, now is the time to ask them. Sir.
How did your education influence you?
My education.
History in Israeli and Palestinian history.
The thing is that I finished high school. I grew up in the church. I was an altar boy. And I used to go to Mass. I'm Episcopalian. I used to go to Mass like 3 times a week. In the summertime, kneeling on the concrete floor and listening to Bible stories. I was an altar boy for many years. And I heard all these stories. And I knew the Bible. I mean, I knew the geography of Palestine and Israel like the back of my hand. And I knew all the names. So when I finished high school, I didn't want to go to Rice University like my mom wanted me to go. I went back to Europe and went traveling around Europe for 3 years. And I wound up in the Middle East. I wound up in Iran and Syria and Jordan, Palestine, Israel. And I wound up coming to a kibbutz in the Jordan Valley when I was 18 years old. And because I was told that you could pick oranges down there, and it was much better than being in the cold snow of Tehran. So I went down there, and I was told that I should ask for Ani Khan, a woman named Ani Khan, head of the volunteers. And Ani Khan in Hebrew means, I am here, Ani Khan. And I didn't know that. So I came to this kibbutz and I said, where's Ani Khan? Okay, you're here. You're here. No, where's Ani Khan? Well, I found Ani Khan and I became a volunteer on the kibbutz. And I was really interested in it, and I liked it. I was picking bananas and stuff, and it was all right. It was off the road, you know. And then I started, I took a little hofesh. I took a vacation. I took a bicycle from the kibbutz and rode from the Jordan Valley all the way down to the tip of the Sinai Desert, and then back across the Sinai, through Gaza, through the West Bank. And I really found it very, very interesting. And that was the beginning of my stay in Israel, which went on, my sojourn in Israel went on for years. I became a lifeguard on the kibbutz, and I got an Israeli girlfriend, and all of that. And then I came back to the United States when I lived in Norway in the wintertime. I'd go to Israel in the summertime, Norway in the wintertime. And in Norway, I lived with a Swedish countess who gave me these books about Israel and Palestine, history books to read. And I read those, and I realized that this conflict, this Israeli-Palestinian conflict, was like a Gordian knot that would not be easily resolved by simply exchanging some territory or something like that. It wasn't going to be resolved in that way. It would require something like the sword of God, just like chop that knot in half. And so I realized we're dealing with something very, very serious, and it's like a knot in the stomach of the whole wide world. Yeah. This conflict. So then I came back to the States. I studied biblical Hebrew and Egyptian in Oslo. And I came back to the States, and I wanted to go to college now. And I went out to UC Davis, and I started my career in college. But I didn't stick to it. I would spend a winter, a fall in Davis, and I'd go up skiing in Tahoe, and I wouldn't go back for another year. And then finally, I went to UC Santa Cruz. I got to get this degree done. And I decided, well, the best thing to do is study history, because I'm interested in history. I think it's very important. And this Israeli-Palestinian history, I know so much about it, and this is a very interesting subject for me, so I'll study it. So I studied it at UC Santa Cruz under Professor Terry Burke, who was a student of Bernard Lewis, like most of them are. Bernard Lewis was this guy at Princeton, a Zionist from England, who kind of was the dean of academicians who studied the Middle East in this country. And I went back, in early 1990, when the Gulf War was starting. And Terry Burke had just come back from a sabbatical in Princeton, and he was going to speak at the Federal Building. And when the first words out of his mouth, this is just like 3 months before the United States goes to war with Iraq in 1991. And the first words out of his mouth were balkanization. And he says, Christopher, you should read this book about Yugoslavia, and I should read The Bridge over the River Dreen and all that. Well, I studied Middle Eastern history and those courses that I needed to study. But it was like my point of view was like not acceptable. I had a lot of experience in the Middle East, but when I talked about Israel or Palestine or anything like that, it was like my point of view was not accepted by professors. And I remember I had one slide presentation. I did a big slide presentation about the Intifada. And I showed these slides, and the kids in the class were crying, when they realized. But the professors never liked my point of view. And I understand why now, because I was seen as being, not on board the Zionist thing. I was asking questions about this. And my specialty during one whole course was we were studying Iran-Iraq war. I was writing about it daily. And the professor there, she was a Jewish woman, she made it very pointed, made it very clear to the class that my point of view is not the one that they should take away. So I was kind of ostracized. And I found out at UC Santa Cruz, it's a school which is basically, at the time I went there, 1/3 Jewish. 1/3 of the kids came from LA, basically. They came up to Northern California to be green and all that, and live in the forest, in the trees and all that, redwoods. And it was, I saw that my discussion of Israel and Palestine was not only unwelcome, I was called a Nazi, for example, because I was supporting Perot. I supported Ross Perot. And the students would drive by and call me a Nazi. I thought, what is that all about? And it's just, I realized that if this school was a very Zionist school, and UC Santa Cruz is even more Zionist today, But in the university level in America, it is forbidden to have the point of view that I had at the time, that I have about Israel. And for example, there was just before I was going back to the Intifada, I took some journalists over to the Intifada in 1990, just after the war, and just after the 1991 war. I took a couple journalists over there to the West Bank and Gaza Strip. And we took pictures and stuff. But just before I left, the Israeli General Counsel from San Francisco came to speak. I think that's who he was. He came to speak at the university. And I had a sign. I was protesting. I had started a group called the Palestine Support Group. And I had a sign which was basically the Israeli flag. And it was pretty controversial. I put, instead of the Star of David in the middle, I put a swastika. And I said, never again. Because I had just come back from the Gaza Strip, and I'd seen what was going on in the Gaza Strip and the terrible things that happened. And I was trying to explain to people that what the Israelis are doing on the West Bank and Gaza Strip is similar to what happened in World War II. And there was a violent reaction. There was, the police had to protect me. And when I came back a couple months later, Tikkun magazine had a picture of me, and they said, "Is the anti-war movement anti-Semitic?" And they had a picture of me up in the tree in San Francisco with that same sign. So you see, it's like when you criticize Israel, when you criticize the Zionist regime, when you criticize Israeli war crimes, it is actually considered in America, at many universities, it's worse to criticize Israel than the crime itself. So what did I learn? I learned how strong the resistance is in American colleges to an open and honest discussion of what Israel and Palestine are all about. And I'm of the opinion that, like Alan, that Zionism and Avi Shlaim, that Zionism is a greater danger to Jewish people in this country than anything else. Zionism actually puts Jews in great peril. I've seen it. I mean, I lived in Israel. A lot of my friends went up to Lebanon in '82, and they came back broken people, very broken people. You know, these kids that I knew growing up as a lifeguard, when I was a lifeguard there, good kids, young, healthy Israeli kibbutzniks, they go up there and they did terrible things in Lebanon, and they came back and they just want to sit there and talk to me about what they did. And it's just like what we have with the people coming back from Lebanon, or people coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan today. These young American men who just, they wash their hands, but they can't wash the blood off, And they say, "Mom, the boy that you knew is no longer here. He's gone a long time ago." And then they wind up committing suicide because they can't live with themselves. So, we have to have an open and honest discussion of what is Israel, what is our role as Americans and American Jews to Israel, and where do we want to go? If we let these guys, Netanyahu and the Begins and the Shamirs of the world, if we let them decide the agenda for us, it will be much worse than the past. That's a long answer to your question.
Are they fundamentalists, those guys?
Fundamentalists?
No, it's a very specific question.
Yeah, they're not very religious. If you mean religious, they're not fundamentalists. They're extremists. You have to understand that their ideology comes from Jabotinsky. You need to understand Jabotinsky's understanding what New Zionism was. You see, New Zionism, Jabotinsky headed the New Zionist organization. He died in New York City in 1940. When he died, Mr. Netanyahu took over that organization. That was Ben Zion Netanyahu, his father.
Is there an element of biblical destiny in this?
Well, there is perhaps, but I mean, it's like that is not what inspired people like Jabotinsky and Netanyahu and Begin.
Then what did? Well, tell me what did if it wasn't that.
Well,
what drives these guys? What is it? Are they making money?
I think people like Netanyahu are actually psychopaths. I think Menachem Begin was a psychopath, and there's a bit of psychopathy going on here because you see that Mr. Netanyahu will go up and speak in front of the United Nations, and he will just tell big, whopping lies. And that's an indication of somebody who's not functioning on all cylinders. He's a liar. He got up there and talked about how they found this piece of pottery and it's written on it Netanyahu. He says, "That's my name." Well, his father's real name is Milakovsky. They took the Netanyahu name, a couple years ago. So when Netanyahu lived in the United States in the 70s, he used the name Nete. So it's like, there's a lot of psychopathic behavior going on here. And I would say that the Irgun and the Zionist terrorists that came out of the Irgun and the Lehi were themselves part of a psychopathic organization. That's what I think it is. Your question there, Henry, please.
Can you explain Zionism? I think a lot of people don't really have a good idea what that is.
Yeah, Zionism is, in briefly, it's Jewish nationalism. But it's much more than that. There's a very good set of books called the Encyclopedia of Zionism in Israel, printed in Israel in 1971. It's in English, and it's very hard to find. But I'm lucky that back in Sweden, in my town, they have a copy downstairs, and it's very interesting. And if you read the articles in that 2-volume set, it's blue. And if you read about the Rothschilds, especially how the Rothschilds played a role in this whole creation of Zionism, you'll read that they fostered these secret societies called, like B'nai B'rith was one of them, created in 1843 in New York City, and the B'nai Moshe. The B'nai Moshe was an extremely secret society that went to the Jewish communities in the Pale of Settlement and basically told the people that you're not Eastern Europeans, you're not Russians, you're not Lithuanians, you are Jews, and your identity is Jewish nationalism. And you should aspire to going to Palestine and repopulating the land of Palestine, of Israel, and learn Hebrew. And so this became a big trend in the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s. So that, and then finally, like in 1910 or something, they created a dictionary. There was one man in Poland who created this dictionary of Hebrew. They reconstituted the Hebrew language. They took biblical Hebrew, added water and stirred, and produced a language, a spoken language, which is what Ivrit is today, what people speak in Israel. But they needed people to go there. And the Rothschilds were the ones who were creating all these settlements. The first 30 settlements in Israel were created by the Rothschild family. Rishon LeZion, for example, the first in Zion. That's where Mr. Ben-Gurion was a picker of the grapes for the Rothschilds. And they said, this would be a good candidate to be the president of Israel. And he became that. And so they created this, and the reason why I think they created it in the first place, they started this in the 1860s, is because they owned the Suez Canal. And they thought that it would be a very good time to have a state there on the Suez Canal to protect their investment and to create this state of Israel. The Rothschilds are sons and daughters of the rabbi, Amschel Bauer. But they themselves are not willing to live there. Jacob Rothschild doesn't live there. Nathan Rothschild doesn't live there. They very seldom go there. But they created the state. They built the Knesset. They built a lot of the buildings. They built the settlements. And so they wanted to bring these people to populate the state, which they've done. And now, of course, the population's changed a great deal. Now we have a population in Israel of many Russians, mostly very many religious people, or so-called religious. And the secular Jews, the Labor Party Jews and the secular Jews have left. They've gone to America, many of them, to Europe. They're trying to get out of there. But to answer your question, it's Jewish nationalism, but it has a much bigger component than that because Israel itself is like the operational arm, the fist of the Zionist enterprise, which is international. City of London is the shoulder. Paris, New York, Miami, Los Angeles. Israel is just the operational arm. So these characters who did 9/11 and the Israelis who did 9/11, they have support in the City of London. They have support in New York. They have support in Hollywood. So that is, for Israel, the hinterland, to answer your question. Any more questions? Sir.
Yeah, I'm wondering to what extent you've looked into the connections with the Bush administration and this whole situation, and I want to connect a few dots first that I think are important. So, when you mentioned that the planning would take several years to carry out this type of an operation, that struck me as important because that means that much of that planning took place before Bush was elected to office. So we look back at the election itself, and many people think it was stolen. They think that because the computers can be rigged, and many of the computer firms that handle the vote are owned by Republicans, and the chairperson of Bush's election committee in Florida happens to be the Secretary of State who oversees the count. Well, if there's no bigger conflict of interest than that, But
Right.
in any case, then the Supreme Court, who they nominate the justices, goes ahead and gives them the election. So, who does he nominate as chair of his selection committee? Dick Cheney. Lo and behold, Dick Cheney selects himself to be vice president. Now, if there's not a fix that's in when that happens, so it was preordained that we were going to have Dick Cheney as vice president and Bush as president well before the election took place.
Yes.
So they already had plans when they came into office that they were going to
Yes.
invade Iraq. They already
Yes.
had the 9/11 Patriot Act totally written out.
Right.
All this stuff is ready to go.
Right.
So it seems quite obvious to me that they're more than complicit in the whole situation. But on top of that, months before, there was a pipeline going across Afghanistan.
Yes.
And the U.S. was negotiating with Afghanistan
Right.
about that pipeline being
They
completed.
wanted to create that pipeline.
And they couldn't get an agreement with Afghanistan.
Right.
And they were told, I think it was, I forget the
Yes.
lady's name, that said, no, I forget.
In Berlin, they were told, they
you
said,
have a
you
choice, you want.
will
this
accept
agreement or you
our
want
carpet of
bomb.
gold, or you will be carpet bombed.
Yeah,
That was in Berlin.
so they got
Yeah.
carpet bombed.
That's right. Yeah, you're talking about, these are some of the some of the first articles I wrote about this 9/11 thing. The pipeline that you're talking about was to take the gas from the Turkmenistan down to the Gulf and also over to the border of India. And that's called the Tapi Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India pipeline. And that's not being built. They're going back to that. What's interesting is that the oil fields of Turkmenistan are owned by a man named Maiman, M-A-I-M-A-N. He's an Israeli, and he had a very close connection to Turkmenistan, and he actually wound up getting possession of many of the reserves of Turkmenistan. So, as you say, there are these other interests, like today in Iraq. The Rothschilds own the largest oil company in Kurdistan, in the north. In the Golan Heights, Rupert Murdoch, Dick Cheney, and Rothschilds own the oil company, gas and oil company called Genie, I think, in the Golan Heights, which is occupied territory. So if they can redraw the map of the Middle East and give that Golan Heights to Israel, the problem's over. So there's a lot of issues there. I mean, but of course the election of 2000 was given to Bush because the Bushes were on board with this. In the 1979 first time when they talked about at the Netanyahu Institute in Jerusalem Conference, 1979, George Herbert Walker Bush, was the speaker there as candidate for Vice President of the United States. And he spoke and he said, yeah, we're ready to go. We're ready to go. We're ready to fight that war on terrorism. Hit them hard. And so this is all kind of like family organization. And if you look at some of these legal companies, these lawyer companies who were involved in the Florida thing, I think Skadden Arps played a key role in that. I can't quote me on that, but I think Skadden Arps played a key role in the Florida, boondoggle. Next question, ma'am, please.
Okay. I think it was 93, 4, 5, Brzezinski wrote Grand Chessboard.
Yeah.
And Grand Chessboard, he says, along the lines of U.S. full spectrum dominance, it's important to control Iraq, to control Eurasia. So, I mean, I never associated him, or should I, as being a neocon or a dual citizen. I mean, it seems like the Greater Israeli plan somehow fits to non-Israelis who want to create world dominance.
Right,
So I
right.
don't see that. I love your whole everything so incredible.
Right, but one of
I
the
don't see that part of it.
Well, one of the things is that we're going along with the Balkanization plan. We went along with the Balkanization plan of Yugoslavia, right? We were the active partner who created the Balkanization of Yugoslavia.
We mean just the
The United States, the bombing, the NATO bombing.
Yeah.
We destroyed Yugoslavia,
Right.
created Serbia and Montenegro and all these.
Right.
And by the way, the Montenegro, the Rothschilds got a big chunk of Montenegro.
Oh.
The Bay of Kotor, they built a big casino down there. Nathan Rothschild, along with the Libyan son, Gaddafi's son, and Oleg Deripaska, they created this casino resort for yachts in Montenegro, one of the most beautiful ports in the world, harbors in the world. But so that when they break up these things, they choose the pieces they want. You see, when you break up a big country and you break it into pieces, well, I'll take this piece, thank you very much. You see, that's how it works. And so you see that the Rothschilds are always interested in owning strategic minerals. Strategic, what's really strategic? The gold, the oil, the gas, the diamonds, the gold mines. So when France went down to Mali, They were protecting 3 big gold mines that were owned by the Rothschild family. That's why they went down there, because they didn't want to lose those gold mines. And they have 10-year plans to extract all the gold. And they have it all mapped out, that in 10 years we'll have gotten most of the gold, then we can just close the mine and go home.
Oh, but you didn't say Brzezinski. What is Brzezinski?
Well, Brzezinski is one of these, he's like Kissinger. He belongs to this group of people who are like architects. And they draw up these plans, these long-range plans. And Brzezinski, you know, he wrote that chessboard, the grand chessboard and all that, yeah. And there are these people like Henry Kissinger that think about these things in terms of long-range plans, what you're going to do and how you're going to do it.
So is he how allied directly? I mean, the mindset's the same, but how directly in the matrix would you praise somebody like him?
Well, I don't know. He's probably just a senior architect. I don't know. I can't say much more about Brzezinski than that. I haven't read all his books. You know,
Okay,
but
and then the Amsho original Rothschild from
Yeah.
Frankfurt,
Yeah.
and he had the 5 sons.
Yeah.
So you get the story that he was just this really poor guy in the ghetto in Frankfurt, you know, and then he's trading in
Yeah.
little trades of
Yeah.
rare metals to the rich people, and
Yeah.
then built the banking system.
Yeah.
And then you hear what you said, the secret societies and all
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
So, I mean, it looks to me like, you know, the Jews were mistreated for a long time. They weren't allowed to sell cotton and rare goods. They weren't allowed to own land. They had this little niche
Yeah.
that the Goyim were not allowed to make use
Yes,
of.
yes, yes.
So from that little niche, these poor Jews built this. So
Yeah.
it seems like there's somehow this battle between 2 sides. One exploits the other. The other
Well,
exploits
yeah,
the
and
other.
there's big
Why?
difference when you talk about, you know, European Jews. The Bauers and the Rothschilds belong to the German Jews, who are a little bit older and very well educated, and they learned from the Bavarians, they learned from the Illuminati, the secret society, how it works, how to be a little bit tricky. Whereas their poor brethren, their cousins in Eastern Europe, were often illiterate, living in the shtetl, and not being, you know, they would come to America. When the Rothschilds went over there to get these people from Eastern Europe, many of these Jews came to America, and they were illiterate. And they come to Ellis Island, they say, can you sign the form? The man says, I can't write my name. They say, okay, make a cross. I can't make a cross. Okay, make a circle. So they make a circle. And that's where the word kike comes from. Kike comes from the word keikel. And that's what the German Jews is a derogatory term for their less educated, illiterate brethren, or not even brethren, but their co-religionists who came from Eastern Europe, who were illiterate. The condition of the Jews in Eastern Europe was very, very poor. They were often illiterate, and they lived under the dictate of the rabbi. And the rabbi told them, and many of them didn't even know that America existed, you know, in the 1800s. They were kept so, you know, it's pretty backwater. Belarusia, Lithuania, and the Pale settlement is a place where the sun doesn't shine quite so brightly.
Yeah.
Something like that.
Yeah.
And that's where the first aliyah came from. The first wave of immigration came from Russia. And these were people who were told by the rabbi, you are going to learn Hebrew, you're going to be Zionist, and you're going to go to Israel. And that's where they came from. That's that fundamentalism you're talking about. These people came out of Grodno and Bialystok. What happened with the religion is, I learned this from the Encyclopedia of Zionism, is that what the Rothschilds were successful in doing, they got an Orthodox rabbi in Bialystok, Poland, which is by Grodno, by Lithuania, in the northeast corner of Poland. They got him to marry the political ideology of Zionism with Orthodox Judaism. And then it became religious doctrine to support Zionism. That's the fundamentalism you're talking about. That's the kind of fundamentalism we're talking about.
But what about it further back to the Khazaria? Some people
The Khazaria,
you
that's...
don't believe into that?
Yeah, sure, I've read those books, but Khazaria, 13th Tribe by Arthur Kessler, that's sure. And there's books, oh yeah, sure it does.
Oh.
And if you read Hebrew linguists, there's a linguist who wrote a book called The Ashkenazi, a Slavic people in search of a Jewish identity. And he wrote another book. This is all based on linguistics. This is from the University of Tel Aviv. Another book called The Sephardim. I think it's called The Berber People in Search of a Jewish Identity, where he goes through Yiddish and all the language. But in any case, we know Jews are from all different walks of life, all different ethnic strains. You go to Israel, you can see it for yourself. When I lived on the kibbutz, there were people from India, people from Morocco, people from Russia, and they look just as different as all Americans do.
Yeah, but do you trace this evil strain to the Khazaria thing about?
Well, no. I don't see an evil strain. I see what I see with the Likud and with the people like Netanyahu. I see misguided psychopaths who seek power. and they will do whatever it takes. In Israel, what you have seen in the last 40, 50 years is what I call social Darwinism, where the most ruthless characters have risen to the top. Back in the days of Moshe Sherek, back in the early 50s, when they did the Lavon affair, there was a big struggle in Israel between the more moderate Israelis, like Moshe Sherek, who was prime minister when they did the Lavon affair, against exactly these people who were behind the Lavon affair. Shimon Peres, Moshe Dayan, and David Ben-Gurion. Those were the terrorists. And if you read like Sacred Terrorism by Levia Rochach, Sacred Terrorism, it's about the history of Israeli terrorism. And her name is Levia Rochach. Her father was the mayor of Tel Aviv. You'll see that this was the struggle. And who prevailed? Moshe Sherek says, I give up. You won. You're stronger. I lost. And that's when the moderates lost and the radicals won. And it's been like that ever since. Yitzhak Shamir is the kind of guy, if you're a political foe of his, you go for a walk on the beach, only one guy comes back. That was Yitzhak Shamir. They kill each other. Zionism is a contact sport. And the ones who were not willing to fight lost. And so what we wound up with in Israel is we wound up with the most radical, ruthless strain of Zionism prevailing. That is the Likud. They're the ones who are willing to blow up buildings and kill people. They committed Deir Yassin, they blew up the King David Hotel, they committed Sabra and Shatila. Why are the Israelis killing Palestinian refugees? Well, think about it. Those Palestinian refugees have a key to a home in Tel Aviv, or in Jaffa, or in Haifa. And if you kill that family and their descendants, there won't be anybody coming knocking on your door saying, this is my house. This is the thing. Zionism Zionism has become the most virulent strain of Zionism has prevailed.
So what kind of psychology do we all have who's trying to rectify this problem? If that's identified as psychopathology,
Yeah.
and it's the upper hand,
Yeah.
violent
Well,
upper hand, what do we do?
Well,
all
obviously
trying to
what,
figure the hell out.
obviously what we do, if we're Jews or not Jews, what we do is that we look at Israel with clear spectacles and say, do we really want to support this? Do we support, bombing civilians with white phosphorus? Do we support a regime that is completely out of line and basically extorting the whole world with its nuclear weapons and whatnot? Or are we going to, for example, join the boycott divestment party movement? Are we going to, raise the issue? Are we going to look at what the Israelis have done, what this group has done? Are we going to try and get, something better in the future? That's what we have to do. And I think I support the boycott movement. I would never buy anything from Israel. I haven't been there since like 1992 because it got so bad, I never wanted to go back. I used to go there many times, but then I would leave Israel and I would take off my slippers, my shoes, and knock the sand off like they did in the Bible and say, I leave. Because it got so bad. I saw people getting shot in the street, and I saw people being brutalized day in and day out. And I said, this is not the Israel that I used to like. Your question?
Speaking to the fourth plane.
The fourth plane
Yeah, the fourth one, the one that,
in Shanksville.
yes, okay. Do you think it's a possibility that its actual target could have been the third tower that collapsed in
Right.
New York City? Or,
Right. Right. That's a good question. Somebody mentioned that to me before. She's asking about the fourth plane, the plane that went down in Shanksville. She said, do I think that was meant to go to another target, like Washington or Building 7? Or
The reason I said the third tower is because it's my understanding that the proximity between the buildings, that tower really wasn't, there should have been no reason whatsoever for that tower to even be in.
100 yards away, 100 yards away.
So.
Okay, what I think, about Shanksville, we were totally deceived. We were shown that there's a hole in the mine. We said that's where the plane went. I went to the local newspaper there. I was an editor, a journalist, and I went to talk to the newspaper. I called the editor and I said, I want to talk to you about how you've covered this event. And he said, okay, come in on Wednesday at 3 o'clock. Wednesday at 3 o'clock, I come in there, and I'm sitting down with an active U.S. military guy who has been seconded to the paper to answer my questions. His name, I think, was Robert Lavernight. And I said, Mr. Lavernight, can you explain to me why there are no pieces of the airplane in this hole where you said where we're told the plane crashed? And he said, we have to understand, the ground is very soft. The plane was coming very fast. And so when the plane hit the ground liquefied and swallowed the plane. But he said, one wing bounced, he said, and went a half mile in the woods. because I knew that the Svanovec, the man who owns the mine, had given his heavy equipment to the FBI, and they went in the woods, only them, only the FBI, and they were recovering a debris field like a quarter mile further in the woods. And he told me this with all due, I mean, with complete, straight face. And I wrote it up in the American Free Press, or American Press I wrote it up in, and it's just absurd. Well, so why were we misled about this? And what was in that debris field in the woods? Well, that's the big question. And as we know, Cincinnati AP reported on 9/11 that Flight 93 had landed in Cleveland Airport, along with another plane. So what I think happened is that the passengers who would have been on Flight 175 and Flight 11 were basically consolidated on one plane that landed in Cleveland. Then there was a culling of the people, and some people were put on a plane, and that plane was the plane that was shot down over Shanksville. And because that plane would have had more people than the small amount that was said to be on the 993, and that debris field could not be seen by anybody, it was only reported in a few local TV stations. They flew their helicopter over the woods. They said, here's the debris field, and you can see pieces of stuff on the ground. And so I called the man who owned the cabins that are in that debris field. His name is Reverend Hoover. He has like 3 family cabins there. And I said, Reverend Hoover, can you tell me why you have not told the American people that the actual crash site is in your yard, your 9-acre parcel? And he said, well, I was trying to cooperate, which is what everybody in that area was told to do. The coroner, who was supposed to be in charge, under Pennsylvania law, the coroner has complete jurisdiction over a crash site. And Wally Miller, a guy my age, tall, skinny guy, I met him a couple times, and he had come into some money. They were fixing up his apartment, his house, his big funeral parlor that his dad gave him. And there were 3 pagers out there, these 3 Hanson brothers, and they said, Wally, tell him what the FBI told you. And I said, well, Wally, what did the FBI tell you? He said, the FBI said, Wally, are you going to be a team player? Which meant, are you going to give us custody of the debris field while you sit over here in a reception center 8 miles away and answer questions for the media and the public and the relatives, which is what he did. So then I called him back a couple weeks later and I said, well, how does it feel? I mean, how do you justify signing death certificates as the coroner for Somerset County for bodies that you never saw? And he got quite upset with it. He slammed down the phone. But that's what he did. That's what he did. He still signed the death certificates, but he was not involved in the recovery of the body parts.
Wow. She and I visited the memorial thing.
In Shanksville?
Yes, and we had doubts to begin with, but after going there, it was almost a given. It's so, have you ever been there?
Mm-hmm.
Well, then you understand how,
Can't get near it.
No. It used to be before they built when they just had the chain link fence up there. There was at that time you were there. They had a chain link fence. That's all they had.
Yeah.
And the crash site was down there in the corner of the field down there. It was like good 500 meters away. And the guard is there. I said, well, what would happen if when we go there and look at that? He says, you'd be shot.
yeah,
He said, there are men there in the woods. They'll shoot you.
yeah, it's treated like,
Yeah. It's like I'll be shot.
yeah.
If I just go down there to see the crash, I'll be shot. And they were serious, but I mean, this is the bluff. Stay away, stay away. It's the same thing when I would call as a journalist. I was always calling up these agencies. What about this evidence? What about that evidence? Oh, we can't talk about it. There are cases pending. So you see, all of the evidence was suppressed. Now, what happened in that debris field in Pennsylvania, in Shanksville, was that the only people that were allowed to go there during the recovery were the FBI. Even the Hoovers could go to their cabins. So the FBI was recovering whatever was out there, whatever body parts there were. And the body parts were all being put on a plane and sent to Dover Air Force Base in Dover, Delaware, where there's a mortuary that's very corrupt. And there at the mortuary, there was 2 FBI agents who were involved in identifying the body parts. Those body parts they could not identify were simply cremated and put in a landfill. So the Dover Air Force Base mortuary has a long history of just frauding. And so this goes back to 2001. So whose body parts were they identifying? This is where you want to start the criminal investigation. You arrest those guys, those FBI agents who were involved in Shanksville and at the mortuary in Dover. And you start there. You just start cleaning up all the people who are involved in the fraud. Because it's a giant fraud against us, the American people. And that's going to take probably a revolution for it to happen. Does anybody else, I want to tell you, if anybody would like to have a copy of my book, I have the book here. This is the basic book, the little book. It's called Solving 9/11, Deception Changed the World. I asked $20 for it, and it presents my analysis in a very readable format. And then if you are really a scholar of 9/11 truth, you might want to get the book called this companion book called Solving 9/11, the original articles. That she has back there. But if you want that, you would have to give me your name and address, and I could take care of that. So, okay, well, I'll sit down up here and sign books for you. Does anybody else have a question? You have a question here.
Yes, with your point about Flight 93, for this to be planned, it had to be synchronized, right? You had a script and you had to go through everything.
Yeah.
Well, the problem with Flight 93 was it left 45 minutes late.
Right.
Right. So it was out of sequence with the script, and it's the one that supposedly crashed in
I think
Pennsylvania.
that the time sequence, that's why it didn't reach its projected
Right.
target.
And the connection with what, like Building 7 collapse without being hit, was it scheduled for that? And plus, there was Delta Flight 1989 that just, where did it go at the same time? And at the same time, they were evacuating the Sears Tower in Chicago, which was also owned by Larry Silverstein, right?
Afterwards, yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, there's a lot of speculation. There's you can go, you can speculate all day long about this and that and this and that. But the fact is that 3,000 people were killed, and that our government and our media have covered it up for 14 years. What really happened, and that makes no sense. If we live in a democratic nation, then the media should have conducted their own independent investigation, as they did during Watergate and other similar situations.
And the same with the Democratic Party.
Thank you. The Democrats, the Republicans, basically all the institutions have dropped the ball. Our media, our academies, our institutions, our universities, our law enforcement, our churches and synagogues. They've all gone along with the official story and left us like the last ones to find out. Huh? That's where we are. The third sector. We don't need to know. Like the New York Times wrote, the public knowledge of 9/11. Well, just be sure that you can know what happened without knowing what happened.
Yeah.
Okay? That's how they treat us. So, without further ado, any more questions? Anybody have a pressing question they'd like to ask? Then I can come up. You can come up if you'd like to copy the book, and I can sign them for you. And thank you very much for coming. It's a big pleasure.